Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. It's good to see you. Today we're going to talk about Pokémon Legends ZA, specifically the improvements that we could potentially see on the Switch 2 based on what we see from the reveal trailer. Now, they don't give us a lot here in the announcement trailer that Legends ZA will come to the Switch 2 with the Switch 2 edition. I'm going to explain what the developers would be able to implement pretty easily that would not take a significant amount of work. It wouldn't take a significant amount of time. I want to explain some things that they can do to make this look incredible. We have seen The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom running on Switch 2 with the Switch 2 edition, and I will create breakdown videos on those to explain the differences. But those look incredible. They implement more and more modern rendering techniques and visual techniques to make games look eye-catching and appealing. So today I want to explain all of those things. But first, I just wanted to share something personal with you. I did recently just get my fourth badge here, so I'm very, very happy about that. It was more difficult than I thought it would be. I am feeling a little bit itchy after having earned this, but I'll be wearing that proudly. Most people put their badges in a little case. I'm going to be wearing all of my badges. I'm just going to fill them up. I'm going to head to other regions. I'm going to fill up my waistcoat with all these badges. I'm going to let everybody know. So there's going to be some information here that I've already covered multiple times before. So I'll put links in the description so you can see my other videos regarding this topic. And I really don't want to repeat myself. So I hope that you'll go check out those other videos covering the topic of the visuals. So this is the first shot we see here, and it's pretty interesting. It doesn't actually really show us that much. What we see is basically a time of day that we have not yet seen in trailers. We have the sunrise here, and you know it's sunrise because sunset generally has warmer colors like orange, red, pink, purple. Sunrises generally are a very pale yellow, a light blue. They're more delicate and softer. But I did notice something interesting here. Now, I'm not approaching this as a gamer. I'm not complaining and expecting everything to be perfect. I'm a games developer, so I need to be able to identify and notice when things are not quite right. And I'm just going to point out something that I did notice here, in that obviously this is a trailer. The game is still in development. It's not finished, but there are visual elements here. There is some geometry that these should not be that black. They're a very dark black compared to everything else. And I believe that the shader on that is not implemented correctly or not finished yet. I believe they may be implementing some other lighting techniques in the Switch 2 version, and that this shader may be from the Switch version because it's basically pitch black, and it shouldn't be pitch black. Nothing else in the scene has that kind of darkness to it, so the black levels don't align with everything else. So this tells me that these visual elements are not calculating any sort of volumetric lighting or fog or reflections that would be present in this scene. So that's interesting to me. As a game developer, I would have to notice that and say, okay, yeah, we'll just fix that really quick. And something like that doesn't take long to fix. It's easy to fix, but you have to identify those things. So you have to point them out and say, oops, we missed something. It's easy for things to slip through the cracks there. So basically what's going to be obvious with this, I'll just let it run. We'll go through it a couple times. Basically what's going to be obvious is we are going to see the Switch 2 obviously has a much higher budget for performance and memory. And when I say budget, I don't mean that you're spending money. The console can only do so much. It has physical limitations. So it's obvious that we're going to see higher resolution textures, something that really broke immersion for me in the trailer that we saw recently in the Direct for the Switch 1 version. Were very, very low resolution textures on the ground, and it broke the immersion for me. But on the Switch 2, we're not going to have that problem. They're going to use their highest resolution assets, the highest quality assets they have for the visual, so we're going to see that. And the game will not have to lower its internal rendering resolution. When the frame rate starts dropping because we are pushing past our rendering budget, we have everything in the game has a rendering cost. Once we negatively affect the frame rate of the game, we can reduce the rendering resolution of the game so that it basically things cost less. It makes things easier to render so that we can have better frame rate. But it's noticeable. The image on the screen becomes blurry and there's less definition because the pixels are bigger. But with the Switch 2 version of that, we're not going to have that problem. The game will look sharp and detailed. It will not have to reduce the resolution. It's just going to stay as high as possible as it can, because honestly, this game is not visually complex. There's nothing really demanding here except for these transparent particles. I know it seems weird, but transparent particles, transparent geometry, where it has, it's slightly transparent and you can see through it, that stuff is basically the most expensive stuff to render. I don't have a Switch 2 development kit, so I have not been able to take a closer look, but in general, on any platform that I've worked on, this is the most expensive thing. And they have a lot of it here, but it's not like it's hyper detailed or anything like that. Again, basically, we're going to see things like farther draw distance for shadows. Usually what happens to make the game easier to render is that the game will stop rendering the shadows once you have shadows at a certain distance. This game uses all real-time shadows that are not baked. There's basically two approaches to shadows. You can process and render them out in real time. That takes quite a bit of calculating. It's more expensive. Or you could bake the shadows in ahead of time. The developers, during the development process, basically calculate the shadows and then it's saved to a file. And so the game does not need to calculate the shadows in real time. But there are serious limitations to that. This game uses a real-time lighting system that can change the time of day. So having baked shadows does not make any sense. It doesn't work. Because the shadows need to change and move throughout the day. So this game requires a real-time shadow solution, and generally that's more expensive. But because the Switch 2 is stronger, we will see that the shadows will be drawn farther away. You can see, even here, the shadows are still being drawn. And on the original Switch, they would have culled it at that point. You would not see these shadows, here or here. Especially if you compare it to Scarlet and Violet, you'll see where they culled the shadows. And I'm not exactly seeing the shadows here, so I think this is maybe back here is far enough to where they've called it. It's a bit hard to see because we can't see that much, but I'm sort of looking back here and I don't exactly see shadows being cast in real time back there. We will come back to the screenshot and compare it to the Switch 1 version. I am noticing that the NPCs here, I'll just get out of the way if you'll excuse me. These NPCs do have some rim lighting on them. It's a shader that I noticed in the Nintendo Direct for the Switch version of this game, that the player has this rim shader that sort of gives the character a bright outline on the edges, a highlight. It's very eye-catching. It may not necessarily be realistic, but it is visually very appealing and it just looks great. It helps the characters stand out more from the environment. The Pokemon tend to have that rim outline effect. Now in the Switch 1 version, I wasn't really seeing it that much on the NPCs, but I do see it here. So I am looking forward to seeing more. I think there are multiple versions of this sort of shader, and I think they use a simpler one for the NPCs so that they don't have as high of a rendering cost. But I see here this has that rim shader. So I'm interested to see. I'm going to guess that the Switch 2 will have all the NPCs with that kind of neat looking outline, while the Switch 1 version, maybe they won't. We haven't really seen enough yet to really determine that, but that's what I'm going to guess. And I can see for certain shadows are not being drawn here. So shadows are culled at this distance. So I'm interested in seeing what the performance is really like on the Switch once I start developing for it and see how far you can press the graphics. So the resolutions on the character for their normal maps here, they don't look different to me. So this tells me that the really basic visuals of the characters, how they look, I think they're going to be very consistent between the Switch and Switch 2 versions. I am noticing that it maintains a higher frame rate. Something like this is generally where you see frame rate drops. I think there are YouTube channels out there that sort of analyze and calculate this stuff, if you're interested in seeing those. But this is where you're going to get frame rate drops because you have particle effects that are basically geometry that use more math to calculate how they should be represented on screen. You have, it's very basic, something called additive blending where it makes things just look brighter. Generally, these sparkles and things like that would use additive blending, and they make things look sparkly and powerful. If you shoot out a fireball, you want additive blending because it makes it brighter. It looks like it has a brightness to it. And something like that takes more processing power. And when you have something like this, you have particle effects and the lighting, and there's some animation and all that. All these little sparkly diddly doos. The halo effect, actually, even just this sort of purple halo effect. You also have, I just want to make sure of this. Yes. So if you have a look here, we'll pause it. You'll see that the screen blurs as that Pokemon transforms. You see that? So that is localized blurring. It's a form of localized blurring where the center of the screen stays in focus, but the farther you go from the center, then there is blurring. And I hadn't noticed that before, but I'm going to go back and take a look at the version for Switch 1 to see if it has this, because I had not noticed it before. So all of these things, it's funny because they're so simple, but they're actually very expensive to render. They cause frame rate drops. This is where you see it hiccuping, and then adding screen effects on top of it like that. So we're going to take a look at the blurring there. That actually, on the Switch 1, something like that could cost you 5 to 6 frames, depending on how you're implementing it. If it's not well implemented, it could cost you 7 or 8 frames per second. And then there are ways to reduce the quality on that so it doesn't look as good, but because it's blurring, it doesn't really matter. Because it's a blurring effect, it's okay to have that at a lower resolution. But we'll just have a look at the smoothness of this. Again, this is a trailer. The actual game will look better. Let's have a look at the smoothness of this. Very smooth. So this tells me that the Switch 2 has just brute force power when it comes to transparent particles or transparent geometry. That's so great. I really like that. That means we get more flashing. Woo, 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 woo. Give me that Porygon explosion. I want it. This looks cool. The frame rate's going to be great. I know that there's going to be hiccuping. There's going to be some frame drops, and we're going to see some stuttering on the Switch 1. That's just how it is with all of these visual effects. But the Switch 2 version, I can tell already, it's going to be significantly better. So I am not necessarily seeing a great sense of volumetric lighting here. And volumetric lighting is an advanced modern rendering technique that allows a game to simulate a sense of density in the atmosphere. It simulates light bouncing off of moisture or any dust particles in the air. It's very visually pleasing. Hyper-realistic, photorealistic games always use volumetric lighting. Stylized games necessarily don't use it. We saw in Donkey Kong Bonanza that they don't use volumetric lighting because it's quite expensive to use. But on the Switch 2, I believe it's not likely going to be a problem. I believe that the Switch 2 is going to be great at volumetric lighting. So I really hope that they implement it here, but I am not necessarily seeing it here. I'm still seeing basic distance fog here. We had this nice lens flare, but this would look quite different if this was using volumetric fog and volumetric lighting. I have seen someone made a video and they said, oh yeah, this has volumetric lighting. Incorrect. This does not have it. This is still using basic distance fog, and distance fog is a rendering technique that we've been using for decades. So it's very easy on the rendering budget. And I'm just going to open up Photoshop and very quickly show you by example what this should look like if it was using volumetric fog or volumetric lighting. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I'm just going to simulate a sense of what this should look like if it was using true volumetric lighting. So I'm using the burn tool and the dodge tool. I'm just going to adjust the settings here until I think it's right. So we have the light source just there. There's the light source. So there should be a sense of occluding here like this. So that actually should be quite a bit darker, right? Because this should be sort of casting a shadow on the dust particles or the moisture in the air. It should look a little something like this, and I'm basing that based off of the light source. See where I'm applying those brush strokes just there. It should look a little bit like that. Okay. All right, and then we want to sort of something like that. Okay. And then we have these mountains here, so there actually should be a little bit like that. It should look a little like that. And then we have these mountains here, so it should look a little bit like that. A little bit like that. We have these buildings low down here, so it should be a little darker here and in these areas. This is the lowest point here. Something like that. And then there should be a little bit there. And I'm trying to exaggerate the point here so that it's easy for you to tell what we're looking at. So I am, exaggerating this a bit, but this is, dodge tool. I'm going to go ahead and give it something like that. There should be imperfections in the atmosphere to that degree. Okay. And then there should be something like that. There should be something like that. And then maybe something like that. Because that's where this is pointed, like that. Maybe not that much. Maybe not that much. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do a before and after. I'll go ahead and just save that while we're here. So I'll get out of the way here just a second. And this is before and after. And obviously I've exaggerated the point just to make things very clear as to what it should look like. So this is more extreme, but this is what it should look like if there was usage of volumetric lighting. And this is what it looks like now. So I'm not seeing volumetric lighting, which is a little disappointing because I know that based on what we've seen from, say, for example, the Switch 2 editions of Legend of Zelda, that they do have volumetric lighting. So I hope they implement that. That would make this game look fantastic, and it's very easy to implement that using modern game engines. It's not difficult to implement. It is difficult to optimize it and make it look coherent and expressive. That's the difficult part. I really hope they implement it because it would make these games just look so pleasant, so visually appealing. Something that I would also really like to see that I do not see here, I would like to see more advanced subsurface scattering on the foliage. Now, subsurface scattering is a rendering technique that is part of a shader that allows the simulation of light entering a surface and the light bouncing around inside the mass of the surface and then the light bouncing out of it. If you go outside and look at trees, you stand with the sun behind the trees and you look through it, you can see the sunlight entering the leaves, and then the sunlight comes out of the other side of the trees, of the leaves, and it just gives it this warm depth to it, and you can tell that this is a real tangible object that exists. Light is entering and then bouncing out the other side. That's in game development and visuals and movies and CGI. This is a rendering technique called subsurface scattering to simulate that effect. It makes things look natural and organic. I don't see that here, and I would really like to see that. Again, it's not difficult to implement that. It's generally quite expensive on the rendering budget, but the Switch 2, we know the Switch 2 can handle that sort of thing because we've seen what the other games look like. So what I would really like to see from Legend ZA is subsurface scattering on the foliage, because it would look nice. It would be very visually appealing. It would be eye-catching. I can tell that they're probably going to try to keep things consistent across the two versions, but at that point, what is the point of making the two versions if the Switch 2 version is not going to look better? There are a few things that I've pointed out that can make this game look incredible. It can look insane, and I really hope they do it. Otherwise, we're only going to have performance improvement, and that's all. And I hope that's not it. I hope they implement volumetric lighting. I hope they implement volumetric fog and subsurface scattering on the foliage. What this does not need is advanced lighting and shadow calculation with physically based shaders. We don't need that. I really doubt we're going to see that. What this most likely will not have is 3D models for the balconies and windows and higher resolution models. I believe all of that's going to stay the same. There's no indication that they would improve that. I personally would like to see an implementation of the 3D models for the windows and the balconies. Obviously on the Switch one, it's not a big deal because there are other priorities. The rendering budget is significantly lower on the Switch, but on the Switch 2, honestly, I would personally allocate some artists and I would say, let's just put windows in there. Even if you just model one window and then in the game engine you clone it. You know, you don't necessarily do it in the 3D modeling program, because then you're duplicating the exact same geometric information over and over again, and then you're just causing yourself extra costs. I would just model it once, put it into the game engine, clone it, and then I would just batch render them so they're all rendered together, and it saves on the cost. But that's not the point. They could have all of that on the Switch too, and it wouldn't really have that much of a performance cost. However, they implemented it. What would be expensive is the development time. I'm certain they have a very limited development time on this project, and that just takes up time. Me personally, I would really like to see if they just got a couple artists and said, look, just spend the week and model the windows. It wouldn't, if you organized it and planned it out, it wouldn't really be that difficult to do. And I hope they do that, because on the Switch one, I can excuse that and say, yeah, okay. But on the Switch 2, I sort of feel like, why wouldn't you just put that little bit of extra work when the end product could be so much better? A little bit of work, just a little bit of focus, a bit of planning, the product could be so much better. The end experience, people will be playing this for years. They'll want to enjoy it for years. You want these experiences to be as good as possible. And I would really like to see that. I want this to be as good as it can be. On the Switch, when I was saying, look, the windows and buildings, okay, they're whatever. On the Switch 2, it's very unpleasant now knowing how strong the Switch 2 is, seeing games like Breath of the Wild. I really hope that they will address that and they'll do something about it. So, okay, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thanks very much for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, I am going to still keep creating my other videos where they're just funny, or I'll come up with like a dumb joke and then I'll just build an entire video around it and have some fun. So I know not everyone's interested in the Nintendo content. And hey, we're all interested in different stuff. We're all here for different reasons. But I'm going to make a lot of regular content for Nintendo for the upcoming future because we have so much to talk about. I'm absolutely jazzed for the Switch 2. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to making games for it. So thanks very much. Hey, if you'd like to try one or some of my games, I'll put the link in the description. I actually just launched a funny speedrunning game called 4 Hours of Watching Paint Dry, and in this game you try to speedrun watching paint dry for 4 hours. Your goal is to complete the game as quickly as possible while gaining the high score. You can perform distractions that will actually speed time up, and you can sort of skip time a little bit by performing these distractions, but they affect your stats, and your goal is to get the best score possible as fast as possible. This is an exclusive game to the PSP, but I'll make a Windows version soon, and then you can play it on Windows. So you can download that and play that on the PSP for free. There's no monetization to that. And then I also just launched the Android version of my action puzzle game CLASHERBALL. You can pick it up on the Nintendo Switch eShop, but I also have free versions for the PS Vita and Android. You can use touchscreen controls or hardware controls. And there's no monetization there. The entire game, it's totally free. Full version, it's just because I like these platforms and I know that this gives more people a chance to enjoy the game. So feel free to pick up those games. I'll put the links in the description. Thanks for spending time with me today. Take care, everyone. Be well. Okay, I'll see you.